Okay, so today on the bench we've got what is hopefully a very quick repair. We're not making sawdust, instead we're trying to deal with the sawdust problem because this is a record power dust extractor, or at least the top portion of it that contains all the electronics. We got this as part of a job lot which we've had in storage for ages untested, and then when we came to try and use it, it basically tripped the power straight away. So there's definitely something going wrong inside of it, possibly a short. This particular model is a 600i, an RDX 600i, which I think is discontinued, but I imagine it is extremely similar to the current version. I think it's the 1000. And to be fair, this repair will apply to probably just about any piece of workshop machinery that runs on an AC motor, or at least a single phase AC motor. So stick around, you might learn something. I have to say before we start, I'm not a qualified electrician. I barely even know what I'm doing. It just turns out that this repair is probably going to be a very simple one. So I think I can get by. Do not take it that anything I'm doing here today is, you know, certified, above board, or safe even. I'm just doing the best I can with what I've got. If you've got something that's broken, it's up to you whether you try and repair it yourself or take it to a qualified technician. Anyway, with that said, as I said, this is the top half of the unit. I've already actually unscrewed the top, which is done just by taking out 2 screws on the bottom. Once I did that, I took the top off, which is a bit tricky to do because it's attached by wires to the power cable and everything in the middle. But as you can see, there's basically an electric motor, a power switch, and not a lot else. But on the back side here, I'll just move the lid over. See this little black plastic clip? Well, inside that little black plastic clip was this. Let me zoom in. This is quite clearly a capacitor of some kind with a blown top. Even if you don't know much about electronics, when you've got some kind of power issue like this, it's often worth having a look because it's quite often capacitors that are at fault. And the good thing about capacitors is they often give us a very strong visual indication that there's something wrong. In this case, it's completely blown itself apart. So I guess that this was probably the issue. Now, I must admit, I don't know much about electronics to start with, and I know a lot less about electronics when it's nothing to do with amplifiers. But what I could see that was a little peculiar about this capacitor was that it had 3 wires. So it's not just a standard capacitor. Now, having dealt with valve amplifiers before, I've seen little canister capacitors before with 3 wires, such as this one. This one's a dual power filter cap for a valve amplifier, and what it effectively is just 2 capacitors in one can. They share a ground terminal, and then you have the 2 live terminals for each capacitor just inside one can. So I thought it might be something like that, although I knew that this probably didn't require a power filter cap. What I had seen in the past, looking around before, was what are called motor run caps, which again come in canisters very similar to the power filter caps. And they are used on AC motors such as this to provide a constant power supply and a smoothing of the power supply while it's flicking around on AC. So I thought initially that's what it was. But it turns out it's not that at all. After searching and searching and searching online, for a start, you can't find any motor run caps with values that small. They just don't exist. The label actually reads 0.1 microfarad X2 and 0.005 microfarad Y and another one. So it's almost suggesting that it's got 3 or 4 capacitors in there. What I came to realise was the X2 and the Y, X2 does not refer to 2 times capacitors, it refers to a safety rating of capacitors. Long story short, what this actually is a power supply filter. It stops AC signal from the mains or rather interference on the mains, getting into your sensitive electronics, or vice versa. In this case, it'll be stopping hum from the electric motor running, going back out onto the mains. Now, strictly speaking, the unit doesn't actually require this to run, which is why I've just chopped it off. And I can tell you that I've already tested literally just with it chopped off, no other modifications done, and the motor now does run without shorting the electric, which is great. But it's very antisocial and not a good idea, especially when you're running things like guitar amplifiers, to run one of these things without the intended filters on there. And I would imagine you would find that many of your home workshop machines, whether it be table saws, band saws, anything like that, if they're well made, they probably should have one of these on them. If they don't, it would probably be quite a simple mod actually to add one of these. But nevertheless, so I actually noticed that the label on this says RS, which stands for RS Components, which is a UK, they're more of a distributor actually of electronic components, very well known. So I got in touch with them, and unfortunately this particular capacitor is actually discontinued. I got in touch with Record Power and they apparently did stock them, but they wanted something like £10 plus another £5 postage for that, which I thought, alright, for like new old stock type stuff, it's not extortionate, but it's not cheap either. We can't really blame them. I mean, this is a discontinued model. It says on the label that it was built in 1999, so it's 20 years old now. But instead I began looking for an alternative. Now, I must admit I had some difficulty in actually trying to find an alternative, because I was really struggling for what to search for. I think the RS website isn't particularly good really for searching for specialist items unless you really know what you're searching for. I initially actually started looking for capacitors which were high enough rating to actually just make my own. What you actually have is, I believe it's known as a delta configuration, and what it consists of, you have an X-rated safety capacitor going between the two live AC lines, and that basically allows AC interference to pass between the AC lines as they come into the device, effectively allowing it to sort of even out and bypass the device to some extent. And you also have two Y capacitors going from either side of the power lines to ground. Now those Y capacitors, I think, are what's the equivalent of what's known as a death capacitor on the old valve amplifiers, because you effectively have a capacitor going from your mains power supply to the ground on your chassis. Now, if that capacitor was to fail, potentially it could just break the connection, or it could short out and it could connect live to the ground of your chassis, which you definitely don't want if you're touching it. That said, all of that only really applies if your device is not properly grounded. If your device is properly grounded, then you'll find that any escaped current will just go to ground, and hopefully it will blow a fuse or a trip switch or whatever and cut off pretty quickly, as it has been doing. So that is actually what the fault was. The Y capacitor had probably blown and it was causing a short to ground, so as soon as you turned the thing on, bang, the trip switch in the house was going, which is great. It means that the electrics in the house are actually doing their job. What we want is to effectively replace that capacitor. Now, I've already said I couldn't find an exact replacement, not for a reasonable price anyway. What I did initially was I went looking for equivalent capacitors that I could use to make my own delta configuration, take 3 of them and bodge them up kind of thing, and that's perfectly doable. You can definitely find the capacitors out there to do that. They will generally be your typical kind of polypropylene film ones or equivalent, but they have to be rated obviously high enough voltage, but they have to be X or Y safety rated in order to carry out that function, because you really don't want to cheap out and use crap capacitors on there and then have them blow and kill yourself. So use the correct kind of capacitors, people. But even that's a little bit dodgy. You don't really want to have to bodge up something that is an imperative part of the safety of your device. I then managed to discover that actually you can buy the equivalent of these things pretty easy, and these are standard capacitor values, and they're dead inexpensive, so I ordered a couple of them, and this is what I've got. So you can see that little diagram in the top right hand corner, which is the kind of the delta configuration I was talking about. You've got the bridging capacitor at the top there, and then you've got the two little Y capacitors going to ground in the middle. So this is a purpose-built thing. It's actually a paper-based capacitor, which I found kind of funny, but as you can see on the top there, 100 nanofarads, which is 0.1 microfarads, and two 4.7 nanofarad Y capacitors. The other one was 5, but 4.7 is close enough. It's still going to hit about the right frequency. So there we go. So all I've really actually got to do is find a way to fit this into the dust extractor in the place of the old capacitor, and it should be good to go. There we go. If anyone out there more experienced than me sees anything wrong with that, by all means do tell me, but that looked good to me. Let's check, obviously, when I pop that back down and put it back together, that should be nice and secure, no problem at all. Let's just get it popped back together and give it a quick test. Well, time for the acid test. This is either going to work or all the electric's going to go off and the camera's going to go off as well. Let's give it a quick try. Well, that looks good to me. One glorified vacuum cleaner ready to go. Well, as I said, this video it was a pretty boring one as far as I could see, but I thought it might be useful to some people. So I thought I might as well record it while I was doing it, just in case anyone found it useful. Until next time, goodbye.